Alcohol prohibition was this disastrous experiment started in 1919, and it lasted for 13 years. And there is this wonderful HBO series called Boardwalk Empire, came about maybe 15 years ago or so, maybe 20 years now. And all you have to do is watch episode one. And it's basically about the New Jersey minor criminals, and it starts with them in an office holding a big party on the eve of prohibition. Why would they be celebrating alcohol prohibition with alcohol? Because they know that everybody drinks. The mayor drinks, the chief of police drinks, the inspectors drink, everyone drinks. And they saw that they could make a fortune off of this. Plus, with the extremely high risk premiums involved in smuggling, this is how we get such massive amounts of corruption. So much so that J. Edgar Hoover, fought very hard to keep the FBI out of drug prohibition and counter narcotics operations, because he saw how absolutely corrupting it was to prohibition agents during alcohol prohibition, and he did not want that infecting his organization. You have this much demand, and it's relatively easy to supply the product, people will take the risks because they think they'll get away with it. And by and large, most people did and still do get away with it. And so for the people who aren't caught, prohibition actually helps them in the sense that it offers them an incredible price support for something that really isn't that valuable, right? And it also leads us into the iron law of prohibition, and how this turns the market into a far more dangerous place that produces drugs that are of higher potency, higher purity, more difficult to stop, easier to manufacture, and more problematic in every way. If you look at the lessons from alcohol prohibition, that helped transform a nation of beer drinkers and wine drinkers into a nation of hard liquor drinkers. Because if you were a smuggler, a bootlegger during alcohol prohibition, the last thing you wanted to smuggle was beer. It's big, bulky, low potency, and low profit. And plus, if you have a big barrel of beer on your back, you'll be spotted and you'll go to jail. So if you wanted to smuggle, you wanted the most potent form of alcohol available, which would be moonshine or other types of hard liquor, because it's more compact and more potent and more profitable and easier to smuggle. And that's how we get to other types of evolution of the drug markets today. So back in the 1980s, for instance, when I was in school, the biggest drug threat was thought to be marijuana, cannabis from Colombia and Jamaica. So when Ronald Reagan throws the Coast Guard and all kinds of policing resources at this problem to try to cut off those shipments of cannabis. Well, it didn't take long for the Colombian smugglers to realize, hey, we got something else here that's far more profitable. It's not big and bulky and smelly like these gigantic bales of marijuana. And the dogs don't know how to detect the stuff yet. And you could send it with tourists and suitcases. You could hide it in shipping containers, nooks and crannies. And that, of course, was cocaine. And in still other ways, our war on cocaine helped popularize the poor person's cocaine, crack. Again, easier to sell and produce, and much more rapid onset. And our war on crack in some other ways helped repopularize the poor person's crack, methamphetamines, right? So each time you end up with a more problematic product taking over the market. Similarly, that's how we got to fentanyl, right? The war on opium became, the other forms of opium became easier to produce and conceal and consume. That leads us to morphine. It leads us to heroin. The war on heroin helped popularize a substitute for heroin, fentanyl, to the point where it's very hard to find heroin on the streets today. People don't want fentanyl. They generally don't. But again, it's all there is. And so that's why we forced people into this very dangerous market involuntarily. If you show me what the market and what the incentive structures are today, I'll show you what the market will look like tomorrow or the next year, right? And that is kind of a description of the iron law of prohibition, that it offers the most perverse incentives to traffickers to traffic in more potent substances that are easier to produce, harder to stop, and more problematic, but more profitable in the end. So we keep getting this evolution because all the incentives line up in that direction. We have no counter incentives that regulation might provide or other types of incentives, and so we end up with far more dangerous markets over and over and over again, and we're reaching a dead end, in my opinion, or not a dead end, but we're opening a Pandora's box to a far more problematic world. So there is a current belief amongst some drug warriors, many drug warriors, that the way to deal with fentanyl is to go after the precursor chemicals. That's how you can solve this problem and end the deadly scourge. Well, we live also in the age of AI, which is helping people discover new types of drugs, sometimes for the better. So you may have heard about anti-drug resistance bacteria that are overwhelming our current antibiotics. And AI has helped scientists identify which potential new compounds could combat these drug-resistant strains of bacteria, because it can process 10,000 articles and remember which compounds are the most likely to succeed, et cetera, and correlate all that data that no human could do. Similarly, I believe that there are many chemical pathways to the same or similar destinations, and that if you try to ban these particular precursor chemicals, there are many analogs of fentanyl and whole new classes of drugs yet to be discovered that AI can help traffickers discover. And they're not going to do randomized control trials. They're not going to do all kinds of animal testing. They're going to test it on humans, basically. And that leads us to a really dangerous new world that we can barely comprehend at this moment. We've had many opportunities to learn lessons, even in the time that I've been involved in this field. Those lessons are quite clear. However, we have very little national attention focused on this, and very little institutional memory. So the bureaucrats, congressional staffers, they're in those jobs for a little while, they get reassigned to something else, and the next crop comes in. And so if you go to the House of Representatives, for instance, the average congressional staffer is maybe 25 years old with very little institutional memory of what happened before they came on board. And there's a high turnover rate. And so each time I try to educate them, they say, but have we tried interdiction yet? Have we tried alternative development in Colombia? Have we tried this? Yes, we've tried that many times now. And here's why it hasn't worked in the past. There are some really clear textbook cases that really illustrate what's going on here. When I first started in this field, there was a very popular movie by Steven Soderbergh called Traffic. It came out, I think, in 2000 or so, maybe 1999. And it was the first Hollywood feature to really take on the issue of the drug war and prohibition head on. And in it, there is this somewhat fictional character. Michael Douglas plays the president's drug czar, and in it, you see him going to Mexico and giving a bear hug to his counterpart in Mexico, General Salazar. And he says, "This is a man we can do business with." And it turns out, of course, by the end of the film, General Salazar was working for the cartels the whole time. And so the briefings the U.S. intelligence gave him and all the cooperation and assistance, he was feeding right over to the cartels. Well, this actually happened, and it happened under the administration of Bill Clinton. His drug czar, General Barry McCaffrey, did a similar thing. He goes to Mexico and puts his arm around this guy's name, was named General Jesus Gutierrez Rebollo, and same deal. He was working for the cartels. Right, and so that's straight out of history. But you could talk about many other instances. In Peru, Vladimiro Montesinos was one of the biggest drug traffickers. He was head of intelligence under President Fujimori, so he knew exactly what was going on in terms of military and police tactics and what they were going to do next. Of course, he was working with the cartels. Similarly, under President Calderon in Mexico. When he came in 2006, thought he could be the tough guy, and he was going to throw 50,000 federal forces at this problem and really show these cartels. Turns out his head of security, head of the Mexican Federal Police, Genaro Garcia Luna, was also working for the cartels. He's currently imprisoned in the United States now. But again, we can train all of the militaries of the world and the police departments, and we can vet the sergeants and the captains and the majors and the colonels. But what if it's the general that's in cahoots with the cartels? What if it's the attorney general that's in cahoots with the cartels? There's similarly in Mexico, there was a one of the most feared and most violent cartels back in early Calderon administration was a group called the Zetas, and they were a military organization. They were originally soldiers, airborne units of the Mexican military, trained. Many of them were trained at Fort Benning, Georgia, in the United States, in special operations tactics and stuff. So they took their military training that we gave them and became in the enforcement arm of the Gulf Cartel, and later broke off and formed their own cartel. And they were by far the most violent, the most gruesome, the most deadly. But and they caused tremendous havoc in Mexico. The blood toll, death toll was staggering. But they burned out, and they got replaced. Spectacular violence is not a good strategy for longevity in this field. I think the Sinaloa cartel, for instance, has done much better in terms of longevity because historically they tend to prefer silver over lead. Would you want a bribe or a bullet? They prefer to give you a bribe, but they'll use the bullet if they have to, and increasingly they're doing that. But again, the purpose of drug trafficking is to make lots of money, and you do that by keeping your head down, not by picking fights and turf battles and doing all the other things and raising your profile. Basically at every level, there's going to be corruption because the opportunities are too tempting. Where you have what are essentially, let's be frank about this. When we're talking about drugs, we're talking about essentially minimally processed agricultural and chemical commodities that cost pennies per dose to manufacture. There's nothing magical about these substances. They're not terribly scarce. They're not difficult to produce. They're not exotic, but they are prohibited. And so you take a relatively worthless product, and by the time you smuggle it to the final destination, depending on how tough the border enforcements are, how dangerous it is for the drug traffickers, they get to charge a risk premium to the next person down the smuggling chain, right? And so the US-Mexico border, for instance, is one of the tougher borders to penetrate with drugs. And so just simply by moving it a few hundred meters, you can multiply the value of your product, maybe 10 times. What other commodity? Auto parts, agriculture? You can't magically make something so much more valuable by doing that. And, when I first started in this field, 1998, an ounce of the price for an ounce of gold and an ounce of cannabis were roughly the same, about $400 an ounce. After the 2008 crisis, financial crisis, and all the uncertainty, and especially now, gold prices have shot through the roof. So it's almost approaching $3,000 an ounce. But for most of my life, the gold was around $400 an ounce, give or take. And the idea that you could put a seed into the ground and grow a weed and literally make the equivalent of an ounce of pure gold is insanity, right? That should not be. And when we talk about the powder drugs that are even more processed and refined and more potent, far more profit there. And that is the problem with prohibition, that the modern drug warriors have managed to do what the alchemists of the Middle Ages could never do, right? They trying to find a formula to turn lead into gold. Well, we have a formula that turns basically, vegetable matter or basic chemicals into the equivalent in gold. And we wonder why we can't make this stuff disappear. You will never make these substances disappear by making them astronomically more valuable. And that's what the drug war does. And not only that, but we also have the filtering effect that decade after decade, as we throw more policing and militarized resources at this problem, the types of people we typically capture tend to be the people who are either dumb enough or poor enough and vulnerable enough to be caught, right? They broke operational security. They stayed on the phone too long. They bragged too much. They spent their money in flashy ways. They raised their profile. They get apprehended. Meanwhile, the people we tend to miss decade after decade are the people who are the most cunning, adaptable, innovative, not necessarily violent, but they get on with a quiet business of making lots of money through drug prohibition. And so we've had this Darwinian evolution for my entire lifetime now of the drug market, and that's why it's evolved at such a lightning pace compared to other industries. Right? They don't evolve this quickly because all the market incentives under prohibition line up to produce that result. There's also, corruption at the very local level. Police around the country, it's not that uncommon to arrest a drug dealer and present the evidence to the courts. And if they were caught with 2 kilos of cocaine, they might only present 1 kilo as evidence. And guess what happens to the other kilo, right? But what's the defendant going to do? Are they going to say, Your Honor, I smuggled twice as many drugs. You should go after these police. They're going to keep their mouths shut, right? And so that's the most common form of corruption, I think. I think we need to take seriously the economics of drug prohibition and how toxic and destabilizing that is. I've done a lot of work in Colombia. And so if you want to put a different spin on corruption in the rural areas, this was, the early 2000s, I would go to these villages where the local politician, the local mayor, would be approached by rival factions. You had the FARC guerrillas, who made a lot of money from drug trafficking, and the right-wing paramilitaries, the death squads, working in cahoots with the military, also were even more deeply involved in drug trafficking. And they would say to the mayor, we think that you should not run for re-election next year. We think our candidate should win. And that's a very direct message to them, meaning you better step down or you will not see the sunrise tomorrow. Is that corruption? I mean, they're basically giving a choice. Do you want to see your children grow up, or do you want to just to be over next week? Because they will kill you. There was well over 98% impunity rate for politically motivated killings at the time. The state was not able to protect you, and they wouldn't be able to prosecute successfully the people who did kill you. And so, is that corruption as we understand it, or is that basically a survival mechanism? And you take that and you grow that to the national scale, which is what happened. The paramilitaries, the right-wing paramilitaries, the biggest drug traffickers of them all, had a political project as well as an economic project. And so district after district, they got their people to basically run for election and get into office. By the mid 2000s, late 2000s, there were, I think, a third of the Colombian Congress was under investigation or in jail because of this. The paramilitary had a political project. And in fact, it was the current president, Gustavo Petro, who was a senator back then, who exposed a lot of this and suffered tremendous amount of death threats as he did this. But he revealed how massively corrupting this was. When I first went in January 2001, just as the first U.S. aid was arriving under Plan Colombia, I thought, the proof of concept will fail in a few years, and we'll be done with this process of aerial spraying to destroy coca. In fact, it lasted 15 years. And I remember taking a photo of young children, and they were maybe 10 to 14 years old, holding up crops that had been killed by our spray planes. And they were asking us to stop doing this. And I wish I had kept in touch with those children to see where they ended up. Because 10 years later, 20 years later, they would have had to make some very tough choices living in the rural areas. Do they go deeper to the Amazon, cut down more rainforest to grow more illicit crops? Do they join the guerrillas to fight the state that is doing this to them? Do they join the paramilitaries and the death squads and engage in drug trafficking, but also make a lot of money? Or do they join the armed forces and get involved in the fighting? Any of those outcomes is a disaster for both U.S. policy and Colombian policy, right? Those kids, it's a generational problem. If you don't give them a way out, if you don't show them there's a better way, that dynamic will take on the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. And that cycle needs to be broken. In 2010, I was asked to participate in a tabletop simulation, a war game, if you will, by the Pentagon. It was the first time under the Obama administration they opened up to NGOs, humanitarian organizations, to see what would happen in a scenario of a full meltdown of a country, say in Central America, was the hypothetical situation. And they wanted a 7-year exit strategy, but they predicted by the year 2020, one of these countries would completely melt down from drugs and thugs. And so all the other people gave input about what needed to be done kinetically, what sequence of events to evacuate civilians and secure this and that. And I showed them the photo of those kids in Colombia. And I said, if you want to get out in 7 years, you need to pay attention to these children now, because the same drivers that created the current situation you have right now are going to suck these kids in, and they will become the next generation of trigger pullers, as call them in Pentagon parlance. But you have to take this seriously. And the people who really got that were the senior officers sitting in the back, the 3 stars and that sort of, and because they immediately flashed back to their experiences. They had done multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they said, "Yeah, I remember those kids in my first tour. What happened to them now? Have they joined the guerrillas and that sort of thing?" And it has to be taken seriously.